That night in the Montgomery mansion, the silence felt so thick it almost buzzed in my ears, broken only by the low hum of the heating system. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows, sharp and restless, but inside the air pressed down on me with a heavy, stifling warmth. I had been moving without pause for 14 hours, maybe more, and my body carried it. My uniform, that turquoise cotton dress, sagged with wrinkles, and the yellow cleaning gloves I hadn't bothered to take off only made the bruise on my wrist throb worse. It was the kind of mark people in this house pretended not to see. I had learned quickly to keep my head low here, to stay quiet when tension hung in the hallways like invisible smoke. But that night, the weight in the air felt different, heavier, like the whole house was listening. On the floor of the grand living room, I had spread a thin white blanket across the rug, and there they were, the Montgomery twins, barely 3 months old, both dressed in matching pale blue sleepers, too fragile for a world already colder than it should have been. Their tiny chests rose and fell in rhythm, and I couldn't help but kneel beside them, as if watching over their breaths would somehow keep them safe. When I first stepped into this job 6 months earlier, Mr. Hayes, the estate manager, told me I'd only be cleaning, cooking here and there, just housework, nothing more, but the truth showed itself within a week. The nannies came and went like shadows in this place, never lasting long. By the time I arrived, the last one had quit, and no one bothered to replace her. Instead, they quietly let the responsibility slide onto me, as though it were easier to bury me in bottles and lullabies than to actually hire someone fit for the job. And so I found myself on nights like this, whispering half-forgotten songs, holding feverish little bodies until their fists unclenched, rocking them when my own knees begged for rest. No one asked me to take it on, no one thanked me for it either, but in a house this vast and empty, I couldn't let their cries echo unanswered. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the exhaustion and the ache in my back, a part of me had already decided, if these boys had no one else, they would at least have me. Elizabeth Montgomery had been gone just 3 months, taken during childbirth, and her absence still hung over every corner of that mansion like a perfume that refused to fade. People in the house spoke her name only in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might disturb her ghost, as if her memory was some fragile thing that could crack under the weight of sound. I never met her, but sometimes, standing in the nursery, I could almost imagine her there, brushing her hand over the cribs, filling the air with the kind of warmth I could only fake. Her husband, Michael Montgomery, was the kind of man whose name carried weight on Wall Street, the kind of man whose voice could silence a room filled with men twice his size. People trembled at his decisions, yet, in his own home, he was nothing more than a shadow drifting past closed doors. To his children, he was an outline, a figure who came and went without leaving warmth in his wake. That night, the boys cried for nearly an hour straight, their tiny throats hoarse, their fists clenched against their own helplessness. I tried everything, bottles, rocking, humming lullabies from my own childhood that my mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. One of the twins burned with fever, his cheeks flushed hot against my palm, while the other screamed until the sound broke into raw, rasping gasps. When their cries finally ebbed, the silence left me trembling. My back ached from bending, my arms shook from holding them, and yet I couldn't put them down in that nursery with its hard mattresses and cold air. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving them in a room that felt more like a storage space than a sanctuary. So I stayed with them in the living room, where the golden lamplight spilled across the rug and the fire from the hearth gave off a false sense of comfort. I spread a blanket on the floor and lay beside them, close enough to feel the warmth of their tiny bodies and hear the shallow rhythm of their breathing. My head rested on my arm, just inches from their faces, and I promised myself I wouldn't fall asleep, that I would stay alert in case they needed me. But the weight of exhaustion pressed down harder with every heartbeat until my eyelids threatened to betray me. And there, in that grand house that had seen too many cold nights, I realized something I didn't dare say out loud. I needed them as much as they needed me. Those boys didn't have their mother, and their father was a stranger behind closed doors. I was all that stood between their cries and the emptiness, and though my body screamed for rest, I refused to let them feel abandoned in a world already so quick to take. I lay there on the carpet with the boys, feeling the fragile heat of their little bodies through the blanket, hearing the tiny catch of their breath as if each inhale and exhale tied me closer to them. And though my own body cried out for sleep, I fought against the heaviness in my eyelids because I couldn't risk it, not when I was the only one listening for the sound of their restless whimpers, the only one ready to soothe them if they stirred. Exhaustion moved through me like waves, rising and breaking until my arms trembled and my head buzzed, but I told myself I had no right to close my eyes, not when these babies depended on someone staying awake in a house too big and too empty for children left to cry alone. As the fire hissed in the hearth, my mind wandered back to the sounds I had heard earlier from upstairs, the sharp crack of a door slamming shut, the deliberate weight of footsteps pressing down on the hardwood floors, and it struck me how this house seemed to swallow kindness whole, leaving behind only echoes of anger and control that seeped into every corridor like smoke that never cleared. I thought about how those noises must feel to the boys when they grew old enough to recognize them, how tension would settle in their bones, the way it had settled in mine, and I felt something inside me twist with a fear deeper than exhaustion could ever touch. I had worked in houses before, rich houses with polished floors and cold chandeliers, but nothing in those places ever reached me the way these children did, because there was something about their helpless fists and damp lashes that clawed at a part of me I didn't even know I had left. It wasn't just duty, it wasn't just a paycheck, it was something fiercer, a protective force that rose in me with every cry. And though I was small in this mansion, nearly invisible to the people who ran it, I felt as if the boys themselves had given me a new kind of strength, the kind that refuses to let go even when the body falters. Lying there on that thick rug, with the golden lamp casting shadows across the room and the storm pushing against the windows, I realized this house might belong to the Montgomery name, to Michael who kept his distance, to Elizabeth whose absence was spoken of only in hushed tones, but in that moment it was mine too, because I was the one kneeling on the floor, listening, holding, guarding, promising with every aching muscle that they would not be alone. And though I had no title, no claim, no power in this world of marble and money, I understood with startling clarity that I had been chosen by circumstance to become their shelter, and I wasn't sure anymore if I was protecting them from the house or if I was protecting myself from what this house might make of me if I ever stopped caring. Maybe it was the way their tiny fingers clutched at the fabric of my dress, or the way their cries softened when I bent close enough to whisper against their ears. But I had begun to feel like I was the only anchor they had left in this house that seemed to stretch wider and colder every day. They had no one else, no mother to sing to them, no father willing to step out of the shadows, and I told myself over and over that I wouldn't fail them, not when life had already stripped so much away, but my body was starting to betray me, hours of scrubbing and polishing layered on top of bottles, fevers, and rocking chairs until my bones screamed for rest, and when the boys finally drifted off, my own eyelids sagged heavier than I could fight. I told myself I'd close them just for a moment, just long enough to catch a breath, to feel the pounding in my head slow into something manageable, but I knew the risk in that promise, knew how quickly a moment could stretch into too long. My stomach growled from skipping dinner, my hands shook from fatigue, but I stayed curled near the boys on that blanket because leaving them in the icy nursery felt like abandonment. The lamp spilled a soft golden circle across the rug, and the storm outside beat against the windows with a rhythm that threatened to lull me under, and I forced myself to breathe shallow, to listen for the faint sounds of the twins' breaths like a lifeline that tethered me awake. The house was too quiet to warn me. No footsteps creaking on the stairs, no distant voices carrying down the hall, only the sudden shift of air when the door eased open without a sound. And then there it was, the steady tap of shoes on the wood, firm and unhurried, slicing through the quiet like a blade. My heart stumbled inside my chest before my eyes even opened fully, and when I lifted my head, I saw him standing there. Michael Montgomery, framed in the doorway with his perfect navy suit pressed crisp as armor, the sharp red tie cutting through the whiteness of his shirt, one hand gripping a leather briefcase, the other still resting on the brass handle as if he wasn't sure whether to step further inside. His gaze landed not on me, but on the scene itself. The maid sprawled low to the floor beside his children, the twins pressed close together in sleep, their flushed cheeks soft against one another, and I felt the blood rush to my face as if I'd been caught doing something shameful. My pulse rattled in my throat when his eyes finally rose to meet mine, narrowing with a mix of shock and fury, and though no words had yet left his lips, I already knew the question forming behind them. When it came, rough and sharp, I flinched as though the sound itself had struck me, scrambling upright with my body stiff and clumsy, darting glances from the babies to the man who held all the power in this house, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake the boys. One of the babies stirred beside me, letting out a faint, broken cry, the kind that slices straight into your chest because it carries both need and exhaustion, and I bent instinctively toward him just as Michael's voice cut through the room like ice. His words weren't a question so much as an accusation, sharp, demanding, each syllable hitting me harder than the storm outside. I looked up at him, his frame filling the doorway, his polished shoes on the edge of the rug, and for a second I couldn't find my own voice at all. The man who could command boardrooms and break deals with a sentence was standing here demanding an explanation for why his children were breathing easy on a blanket instead of shivering in their nursery. His anger swelled with every step closer, his questions spilling out. Why were they on the floor? Why was I lying there with them like some careless intruder? And I saw the words die in his throat the moment his gaze caught the edge of my sleeve and the bruise beneath it. He froze, the rhythm of his voice faltering, his eyes narrowing, not with the same fury, but with something unreadable, almost startled, and for a heartbeat I wished the floor would swallow me whole. My lips parted, but what came out was messy and broken, because how could I compress hours of cries and feverish skin into a sentence that would make sense to a man who had never stayed long enough to hear it himself? I forced the words out anyway, my voice trembling but steady enough to reach him, that they had been crying and no one came, that they needed someone, that I couldn't leave them alone in that sterile nursery. But before I could finish, he snapped back with cold dismissal, saying that's what a nanny was for, as though such a person even existed anymore in this house. Something in me, raw from exhaustion, snapped back without permission, my own voice low but unwavering as I met his stare. There was no nanny. There was only me. The silence that followed pressed down so heavily I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and for the first time I saw his mask slip, just barely, before he pulled it back into place. He stood there rigid, his eyes on me, but his voice hardened again, telling me we would continue this conversation in his study. The authority in his tone was absolute, the kind that leaves no room for defiance, and I felt my knees tremble as I rose from the floor, casting one last look at the boys, still nestled together in sleep. My chest tightened with the thought of leaving them even for a moment, but his shadow loomed, and I followed him out with the quiet dread of someone about to be judged, not for her mistakes, but for her very existence in a house that had never once felt like it was mine. I stole one last look at the twins before I pushed myself off the floor, my knees stiff from hours of kneeling, my whole body aching as if it were reminding me I had already given more than it had to give. Their faces were soft in sleep, lips parted, cheeks still pink, and I felt my chest tighten as though walking away, even for a moment, was a kind of betrayal. I wanted to stay there, to keep them within reach, but Michael's presence filled the room like a command I couldn't ignore. The warmth of their tiny bodies clung to my skin, a fading reminder of why I was still here, despite the exhaustion and the bruises, despite the silence that so often made me feel like no one else would ever notice. He watched me rise, his eyes sharp and unblinking, following every movement as though I were both a servant under inspection and a stranger who didn't belong. I moved slowly, careful not to startle the boys, careful not to let the rug catch my shoe, every step heavy with the dread of what was coming. The babies sighed in their sleep, and I wished he could hear what I heard, that fragile rhythm of trust that had been placed in me, not because I was chosen, but because there was no one else left to claim them. I carried that sound with me down the hall, like armor too thin to really protect me, but too precious to let go. When the door of his study shut behind us, it sealed in a different kind of silence, one that pressed harder against my lungs. The glow from the fireplace threw restless shadows across his face, carving the suspicion into sharper lines, as though the flames themselves were feeding it. He dropped his briefcase on the desk with a crack that made me flinch, the sound echoing off the walls like a gavel striking wood, and I stood there, my palms damp against the seams of my uniform, every nerve in my body screaming to be steady. Then his voice came deep and hard, not the polished authority he used in boardrooms, but something closer to raw anger, stripped of civility. "Explain," he demanded, the words shattering whatever fragile calm I had managed to hold on to. In that moment, I realized there would be no avoiding the truth. Not about the boys who had been left entirely to me, not about the bruises that marked more than just accidents of clumsiness. I felt the weight of it all pressing at my throat, daring me to finally speak, even if I knew that whatever I said might change everything. I drew in a breath so deep it burned, and even then my hands trembled as though they might give me away before my words could. I told him the truth, or at least the part I could fit into sentences that wouldn't sound like excuses, that the twins hadn't had proper care in weeks, that the last nanny had walked out and no one had come to take her place, and that everything had landed in my lap, whether anyone cared to admit it or not. I said it plainly, that I cooked, I cleaned, I rocked those babies because no one else did, and that night, one of them burned with fever while the other screamed himself hoarse, and I couldn't leave them in that cold, lifeless nursery, so I stayed with them, where the warmth might comfort more than my tired arms ever could. I watched his jaw clench tighter with every word, the line of his mouth sharp as if he wanted to cut me off, and when I finished he snapped back, asking why that meant I had been lying on the floor with them like some exhausted intruder. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to meet his eyes, even though my heart was rattling so loud I thought it might drown out my own voice. I told him the truth again, this time more fragile but more raw, that I had reached the edge, that my body had nothing left after a day that began before dawn and hadn't offered me so much as a meal. I admitted I'd closed my eyes for just a moment, that I had promised myself it would only be a breath, and I confessed I would do it again if it meant those boys could finally rest in peace, feeling safe for once in a house that offered them so little comfort. For the first time since he had stormed into the room, I saw something flicker across Michael's face, the sharp anger dulling into something heavier, something that looked too much like guilt to be denied. His voice lowered when he asked about the bruise, the one I hadn't hidden well enough beneath my sleeve, and I felt the air thicken between us as my fingers rose instinctively to the tender skin on my cheek. The words caught in my throat before I forced them out, soft but steady enough to land between us. I hadn't tripped. I hadn't slipped. It had been one of his guests at the party last week, a man who thought shoving a servant out of his way was as casual as refilling his drink. I could still smell the champagne that had spilled on the rug, hear the laughter that carried down the hall while I picked myself up off the floor, invisible to everyone who stepped over me, and saying it out loud now felt like tearing open a wound I'd tried to stitch shut in silence. His eyes darkened, and I couldn't tell if it was with anger at me for speaking or at himself for not knowing. But in that moment, the firelight painted him not as the untouchable Montgomery patriarch, but as a man staring at truths he had worked too long to ignore. And I stood there, shaking but unbroken, waiting to see if my honesty would change anything, or if it would vanish into the air of that study the way so many cries in this house already had. I told him how it happened, how I had been carrying a tray down the hallway during one of those glittering parties he liked to host, the kind filled with men in suits too loud and women in gowns too sharp, and how one of his so-called friends looked at me like I was an obstacle instead of a person, told me I was in his way, and shoved me so hard I lost my footing. I remembered the sting of the carpet burn on my palms, the sharp pain in my side when I hit the floor, the clatter of glasses spilling like broken laughter, and I remembered how not one head turned to help, how the laughter in the next room didn't even falter. I lay there for a moment, invisible, realizing that in this house my body could fall and break, and it wouldn't mean a thing to anyone sipping champagne under those crystal lights. When I said it out loud, I saw Michael lean back as though the weight of it pressed against him, his hand gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles paled. The fire crackled behind him, but it didn't warm the silence stretching between us. His eyes shifted, unfocused, and I knew he had gone back to that night himself, the ringing of glasses, the hum of moneyed voices, the echo of deals sealed with handshakes while his guests left bruises behind them. He had been upstairs, I reminded him without words, tucked away on a call, sealing another piece of business, while the rest of us downstairs carried trays like ghosts. He hadn't seen, or maybe he hadn't wanted to. When he finally spoke, his voice came softer, cracked even, as if the confession scraped against something inside him. He said I should have told him, as though saying the words to him now might erase the bruise or the memory of being stepped over. But I couldn't let that stand, not when the truth had been gnawing at me for weeks, and my reply trembled but held its ground. Would it have mattered? I asked him without asking. Would it have changed a thing in a house where even his own children's cries went unheard? I felt my throat tighten as I said it, that he didn't see them, not really, that his sons were learning the language of absence long before they learned the sound of his voice. I told him they had only me, just me, and the words carried both the weight of my exhaustion and the fierceness of my promise. The room grew still, the fire snapping behind us, and for the first time since I entered that house, I wasn't just a maid explaining myself to her employer. I was a woman daring him to notice the life he was letting slip away right in front of him. When I said it, when the word slipped out that in this house I was no one, just the help, the silence that followed pressed down so heavy it felt like it might crush me. Michael didn't answer right away, didn't shout back the way I half expected. He simply turned from me, his profile lit by the shifting glow of the fire, and stared out through the tall window into the darkness beyond. The flicker of the flames caught in his eyes, and I could almost see the storm of thoughts moving behind them, though none of it crossed his lips. For a moment I felt suspended there, caught between defiance and regret, wondering if I had pushed him too far or if I had finally made him hear me. I watched his shoulders tighten as though the weight he carried suddenly became visible, and in the silence I could imagine the ghosts he was confronting. The memory of Elizabeth's voice softening the edges of this home, the cries of the twins on the night they were born, the nights he buried himself deeper in numbers and contracts, because losing himself in business felt easier than admitting the gaping absence in his own bed. I realized then that he wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting himself, the version of him that chose distance over presence, silence over grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher, lower, stripped of its polish, and the two words caught me off guard. "Stay here," he said, not an order laced with authority this time, but something that sounded almost like a plea, though I couldn't be sure. Before I could find a reply, before I could even steady my breath, he turned sharply, his footsteps pounding against the hardwood as he left the room, the door swinging open and closing again with a finality that left me frozen in place. I stood there in his study, the fire popping behind me, my pulse rushing in my ears, trying to understand what those words meant. Stay here? Did he mean in the room, in the house, in his children's lives? My body felt rooted to the rug, my arms still trembling from the weight of the confession, and I didn't know whether to feel fear or hope at the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. All I knew was that something had shifted in the space between us, something I couldn't yet name, and as I waited for him to return, I held on to the one thing I was certain of. I wasn't going anywhere, not while those boys needed me. When he came back, the sound of his footsteps was different, slower somehow, and in his arms he carried two soft blue blankets that I recognized from the nursery I had avoided because it felt like a tomb instead of a child's room. Without a word, Michael knelt beside the twins, his expensive suit pulling at the seams as he lowered himself to the rug, and he covered them carefully, tucking the edges around their tiny bodies with a gentleness I hadn't expected from hands more used to signing contracts and shaking deals. I stood in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, watching this man, who so often moved like he owned the world, pause as though he wasn't sure how to touch his own children. For the first time since I'd stepped into that house, I saw him bend, his knees pressing into the carpet near theirs, his tall frame folding down so he could be near enough to see them as they were, not as burdens left in someone else's arms. His voice broke the silence, softer than I had ever heard it, admitting almost to himself that they were smaller than he remembered, as if their fragility startled him into recognizing how much time he had already lost. His hand hovered above their downy heads, shaking slightly, suspended between fear and desire, as though touching them might shatter something he wasn't ready to face. I stepped closer before I realized I was moving, the words slipping out of me with a firmness I didn't expect, telling him what I knew deep in my bones, that those boys needed more than his name etched onto a birth certificate. They needed him, his presence, his love. When his eyes met mine, I saw the weight of absence flicker across his face, the grief of a man who had buried himself in boardrooms to avoid the echo of a nursery too quiet. And for just a moment his mask fell away, leaving behind a father who saw the cost of his silence. He admitted it then, his voice uneven, that he had been a coward, that he believed drowning himself in work would numb the pain of losing Elizabeth, but all it had done was abandon the children who needed him most. And when he stood again, taller now, straighter, there was a shift in the air around him, the anger stripped away, replaced by a resolve that startled me. His tone no longer cut like ice, it carried something steadier, something determined, as though he had decided in that moment to step into a role he had been running from since the night those boys first cried into a house that had offered them nothing but echoes. His words landed with a finality that stole the air from the room, a promise spoken in a voice that for once wasn't meant for shareholders or business partners, but for me. Michael told me things would change from that moment on, that I wouldn't scrub floors or polish silver unless I wanted to, that my place in the house was no longer as a servant, but as the boys' official nanny, with a salary that reflected what I had already been giving freely. And when his eyes narrowed, a sharp edge flaring in them, he said that the man who had dared lay a hand on me would never again step foot inside these walls, his tone carrying a kind of steel I had never heard directed at anything but numbers. My chest tightened, a knot of disbelief and something dangerously close to relief catching me off guard, and when I whispered the only question I could manage, why, his answer was stripped bare, simple and heavy, because I had protected his children when he hadn't, because he wasn't willing to fail them, or me, again. In the days that followed, the Montgomery mansion seemed to breathe differently, as if the air itself had shifted. The walls, once cold and echoing, began to carry new sounds, tiny gurgles, the rustle of pages turning, the low rumble of Michael's voice reading stories at breakfast. He started appearing at the table in the mornings, still in his crisp shirts, but without the rush that used to propel him out the door, and the sight of him lifting a spoon of oatmeal toward one of the twins while awkwardly dodging flailing hands was something I hadn't imagined I'd ever witness. The house staff noticed too, their movements softer, their glances toward him tinged with surprise, and though no one said it out loud, I knew they felt the change just as much as I did. There were moments when I caught myself laughing, the sound slipping out before I could even think about it, and it startled me because I realized how long it had been since laughter felt like mine instead of some polite mask for the family's guests. I would stand in the doorway as Michael flipped the pages of a picture book, his voice stumbling over the silly rhymes, and I'd see the boys reaching with clumsy fingers toward the colors on the paper, their cries replaced by something lighter, curious, And in those quiet minutes, the tension that had lived in my shoulders for months would finally ease, replaced by a warmth that felt dangerously like belonging. The mansion wasn't a mausoleum anymore, not a place where grief thickened the air and every sound was swallowed by silence. It was shifting into something else entirely, a space where voices carried without fear, where a child's laughter echoed off the marble and softened it into something closer to home. And though part of me kept waiting for the old coldness to return, for Michael to retreat back into the safety of work and distance, another part of me dared to believe that this change wasn't fleeting, that maybe, just maybe, the house wasn't the only thing learning how to live again. It wasn't just me who felt the shift in that house, it was the boys too. Their cries grew shorter, their little bodies less tense, as though they had decided the world wasn't such a frightening place anymore. Their eyes, once clouded with constant need, began to sparkle with curiosity, following light and movement, reaching with tiny fists for my hair or Michael's tie when he dared to lean too close. The mansion that had felt like a marble museum, beautiful, untouchable, cold, was changing. It carried new sounds now, laughter, voices, the kind of cries that didn't slice through you with dread, but settled instead, like ordinary music, in a house finally learning to breathe. One rainy afternoon, I found myself on the living room sofa, a place I once only dusted and never sat on, with both babies nestled against me. One leaned heavy into my shoulder, half asleep, his breath warm against my skin, while the other tugged at the hem of my sweater, babbling noises that made no sense, but somehow felt like the beginnings of words. Outside, the storm pounded against the tall windows, the rhythm of rain filling the space around us, but inside was cocooned in warmth, the fire casting a soft glow over the room, the air humming with comfort I hadn't thought possible here. I let my body sink into the cushions, holding their weight, feeling the pull of their small fingers anchoring me in ways I couldn't explain, when the creak of the door startled me. My eyes lifted, and there in the doorway stood Michael, home earlier than usual. His jacket hung loosely over one shoulder, his hair slightly undone by the storm, and for once he didn't stride in with the air of someone carrying the world's burdens. He simply paused, watching us as though he'd stumbled into a life he wasn't sure belonged to him. The sight of him like that, softened and uncertain, pulled something deep inside me. He stepped closer, not with the sharp authority I had known in those first months, but with a quiet hesitance, his eyes flicking between me and the boys. And in that moment, with the rain tapping its endless song against the windows, I realized how much had shifted. The house wasn't just walls and corridors anymore. It was becoming a home, not because of money or grandeur, but because voices filled it now, because presence replaced absence. And as Michael moved toward us, his lips tugging into the smallest of smiles, I felt for the first time that maybe we weren't just surviving under the same roof. We were building something together, something fragile, but real. His jacket hung carelessly from one shoulder, his hair tousled from the storm outside, and for the first time since I had met him, Michael Montgomery didn't look like a man carrying the weight of deals and deadlines. He looked almost ordinary, almost human. He stood in the doorway watching us, his gaze softening in a way I had never seen, and the corners of his mouth curved into a smile so faint it nearly broke me, because I realized then how long it had been since I had seen him smile at all. His voice, when he finally spoke, was stripped of command, and instead carried a warmth that startled me. Was there room for one more? He asked, not as the master of the house, but as a father searching for a place beside his children. I nodded before my mind even caught up with the moment, shifting slightly to make space beside me on the couch, and he lowered himself down with a carefulness I didn't expect from a man whose movements usually carried certainty. He reached for the twins as though they might shatter under his hands, but the babies responded instantly, one gripping his finger with surprising strength, the other pressing his face against Michael's chest as though seeking something he'd been missing all along. Watching them fold into him so naturally left me breathless, as if I had just witnessed the very first stitch in a fabric that had been torn too long. I leaned back into the cushions, my body sinking in a way it hadn't in months, because for once I wasn't holding everything together on my own. I wasn't the maid trying to do too much, or the nanny stretched beyond reason. I was just Rachel, sitting in the middle of something that finally felt like family, even if I didn't dare name it out loud. The sound of rain softened outside, giving way to a rare hush, and in that quiet, I let myself exhale, not with caution, but with relief, as though the house itself had loosened its grip on all of us. That night, we all stayed in the same room, not because of duty or schedules, but because no one wanted to leave. I stretched out on the sofa. The boys slept in their cribs drawn close to the fire, and Michael sat across from us in the armchair with an open book resting on his lap. His eyes closed before he ever turned a page, and I watched as the book slid slowly to the floor, the sound no louder than a whisper. In that moment, surrounded by the kind of stillness that carried comfort instead of fear, I realized the change was no longer just in the walls of the mansion. It was in us, reshaping who we were becoming together. It didn't take long before Michael began to peel back the layers of what had been happening under his own roof. One morning he summoned Mr. Hayes into his study, his voice steady but edged with something sharper, and demanded to know why no one had told him that the nanny had left, why his children had been left in the arms of a maid who was already working herself raw. Hayes shifted and stammered, giving half answers wrapped in excuses, but Michael wasn't the type of man to accept shadows when the truth was what he wanted. I heard the rise of his voice through the walls, the authority that had once been turned on me now unleashed on the man who had chosen silence. He dug deeper after that, combing through records, speaking with other staff, refusing to let the issue be smoothed over. And the truth unraveled quickly. Hayes had decided not to replace the nanny at all, had chosen to save money by letting me pick up the pieces without ever once asking if I could bear the weight. It hadn't been an accident or a miscommunication. It was a choice, a quiet betrayal made at my expense, and at the expense of 2 children who had already lost enough. When Michael confronted him with the evidence, there was no defense left to stand on. By the end of the day, Hayes was gone, his absence leaving behind a space that felt more like relief than disruption. Michael filled that space with someone he trusted, a man whose first instructions were clear. The children came before everything else. And for the first time since I walked into that mansion, I wasn't carrying the burden alone. He gave me a new title, an official one, and placed in my hands not just responsibility, but recognition. I wasn't expected to scrub floors until midnight, and then cradle fevers until dawn. I had a team now, people to share the load of the housework so I could focus on what mattered most, the boys. It wasn't just the paycheck that changed, though my wages grew in ways I had never dared hope for. It was the shift in how people looked at me, how they spoke to me. Respect replaced dismissal, acknowledgement replaced invisibility, and for the first time the staff treated me not as someone at the bottom, but as someone entrusted with the very heart of the household. And when I caught Michael's eyes across the breakfast table, I saw it there too, something that looked a lot like gratitude, but deeper, almost reverence, as though he finally understood that what I had done wasn't just duty, it was devotion. One evening, after the twins had finally drifted off to sleep, and the house was wrapped in the kind of quiet that no longer felt suffocating, Michael asked me to step into his study. My heart quickened, bracing for another heavy conversation, maybe a critique about something I had missed, but instead I found him standing by the desk with a small box in his hand. He looked almost uneasy, like a boy rehearsing words he wasn't used to saying, and when he offered it to me, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "This is for you," he said, pausing as though the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. "For everything you've done." I opened the lid slowly, unsure of what I would find, and inside rested a bracelet, simple, delicate, not the kind of jewelry that shouts wealth, but the kind that carries meaning. 2 small hearts were engraved into the metal, so subtle they could almost be missed. But once you noticed them, you couldn't look away. They were the twins, captured in a symbol small enough to hold in my hand, but heavy enough to make my throat tighten. For a moment I froze, the air thick around me, because no one had ever given me something like this, not as recognition, not as gratitude. My first instinct was to refuse. "I can't accept this," I whispered, the words tumbling out more from fear than humility. But before I could press the box back into his hands, he shook his head firmly. His gaze held mine, steady, unyielding, and he told me it wasn't payment. It wasn't an attempt to settle some debt. It was thanks. Just that. Thanks. The kind of thanks a man gives when he has realized what he almost lost, when he understands that someone else had carried what he should have. And standing there in the firelight, I realized I wasn't just being seen. I was being valued, and that feeling left me more unsteady than exhaustion ever had. A month passed, and the changes rooted themselves so deeply into the house, it hardly resembled the place I had entered months earlier. I no longer wore the stiff turquoise uniform that once marked me as invisible. Instead, I dressed in soft, practical clothes that let me run across the lawn with the boys, or kneel easily in the garden when their tiny hands reached for flowers. The mansion had stopped feeling like a cage of marble and silence, and instead became a place where I could hear my own laughter mingling with theirs, where I could feel the earth beneath my feet and the sun on my face without wondering if I belonged. And every time I caught the faint glimmer of that bracelet on my wrist, I remembered that transformation wasn't just happening around me, it was happening inside me too. The changes came slowly at first, almost shy, but before long they were stitched into the fabric of our days. Michael began canceling meetings, setting aside calls that once seemed to rule his every breath, so he could be at the table with his sons. I watched him stumble through diaper changes, humming lullabies in a voice too deep to carry the tune, but soft enough to settle the boys anyway. And I laughed quietly when one of them smeared pureed carrots across his immaculate shirt, and he only chuckled instead of scowling. These were the moments that taught me he wasn't just trying to be present. He was learning to be a father, awkwardly, imperfectly, but with a sincerity I hadn't believed him capable of before. One bright afternoon, with the sun warming the early spring air, we took the twins to the park down the street. Michael pushed the stroller slowly, his stride matching the rhythm of their delighted babbles, while I walked beside him, keeping an eye on the boys as their hands waved wildly at every sound and shadow. The air was filled with the smell of fresh grass and the chatter of children in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was part of something that moved at the right pace, not rushing, not collapsing, but steady. I noticed the way strangers glanced at us as we passed, their smiles soft and knowing, as though they recognized something we hadn't fully admitted to ourselves. A wealthy businessman carrying a baby bottle tucked into the pocket of his tailored jacket, a young woman with tired but content eyes fussing over two infants. It didn't look like a household staff walking alongside an employer. It looked like a family. And though no one said a word, I could feel their gazes linger, and for once I didn't shrink beneath it. I let it wash over me, surprising in its warmth, because it told me what my heart already knew. That day in the park, as the boys gurgled happily under the shade of the trees, and Michael leaned down to adjust their blanket, with a tenderness that still startled me, I realized that the mansion back on Montgomery's Hill wasn't just my workplace anymore. It had shifted into something far greater, something that had seeped past titles and wages and roles. It was my home, because home is built on presence and love and the courage to stay when it's hardest. For those boys, the cold emptiness of their first months was being replaced with new memories, ones filled with warmth and laughter. And for me, the loneliness I thought would always define me was dissolving too, reshaped by the very family I never expected to find. For Michael and for me, the lesson was carved deeper than any bruise or sleepless night could leave behind. Family was never about the names printed on certificates, the titles spoken at dinner parties, or the roles we had been assigned. Family, I learned, was about showing up when it mattered most, about standing close in the moments when walking away would be easier, about choosing presence over absence. That truth bound us tighter than any contract ever could, and it reshaped the very foundation of the house we all lived in. That evening, when we returned home from the park, the air carried a softness that still felt new. The twins were bundled in their cribs near the fireplace, their tiny chests rising and falling under warm blankets, their faces serene in the glow of the firelight. The living room no longer felt like a grand hall meant to impress guests. It felt like a haven. Michael sat across from me, his features softened by the flickering shadows, and when he looked at me there was no barrier, no wall of distance, only a man who had finally stepped into his place as a father. His words were quiet, almost hesitant, as though he feared they might break if spoken too loudly. He thanked me for teaching him how to be a father. It was the kind of gratitude that didn't belong in gifts or paychecks, but in the marrow of a man who had learned to love through the eyes of his children. My throat tightened, but I managed to smile, my eyes stinging in the glow of the fire, and I told him the truth that had been waiting on my lips for weeks, that he had taught me to, that he had shown me change was possible, that sometimes even the hardest walls could be broken down. And in that room, once heavy with silence and shadows, there was now only warmth. The sound of gentle breathing from two small cribs, the echo of our voices softened by firelight, and the hum of something I hadn't dared hope for when I first stepped into that house, the sound of a family being born. The mansion that had once been a monument to absence now rang with laughter, tender voices, and the quiet strength of love rediscovered. It was no longer just the Montgomery home. It was our home, and for the first time, it truly felt like one. And if this story touched you even a little, if you felt that spark of warmth that can bring life back into the coldest house, I'd be so grateful if you could support me. Hit the like button, leave a comment about how this story made you feel, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next ones. Your words and your reactions aren't just numbers to me. They're proof that these stories connect with real hearts, and that gives me the strength to keep going.